Claire Whitmore's hands shook so badly she almost dropped her phone into the gutter outside the restaurant. Behind her, through the glass window, Daniel Ashford was still sitting at their table, laughing with the woman he thought Claire hadn't noticed him seeing for the last 3 months. The woman had her hand on his arm. He had not even looked up when Claire walked out. She stood on the wet sidewalk, rain soaking through her thin jacket, and typed the message before she could stop herself. Her thumb moved fast, driven by something raw and furious, and heartbroken all at once. "I'm done. I found out everything. Don't call me. Don't text me. Don't come to my apartment. We are over, Daniel. I hope she was worth 6 years." She hit send before she read it twice. Then she stood there, chest heaving, waiting for the 3 dots to appear, waiting for some kind of response, some kind of apology, some kind of anything. The dots never came. Instead, a single reply landed less than a minute later, and it was nothing like what she expected. "Come over. I'll make you forget him." Claire stared at the screen. Her stomach dropped. That was not Daniel's voice. Daniel would have called her dramatic, would have accused her of overreacting, would have found some clever way to twist the blame back onto her. He never would have said something so calm, so certain, so strange. She checked the number. Her fingers trembled as she scrolled up through the thread. The digits were close to Daniel's, but not exact. She had hit one wrong key in her hurry, in the middle of a downpour, with her heart cracking open in her chest, and the message meant for the man who broke her had gone to a complete stranger instead. Her first instinct was to apologize. She typed out a quick, embarrassed message explaining the mistake, her thumb hovering over send, but she didn't send it. She stood under the awning of a closed flower shop, rain dripping off the edge above her, and read the stranger's reply again. "Come over. I'll make you forget him." There was no explanation, no follow-up, no laughing emoji to suggest he thought it was a joke. Just 5 words that sounded less like a stranger being kind to a wrong number, and more like a man who was used to being obeyed. She should have blocked the number. She should have walked home, cried into her pillow, called her best friend Grace Bennett, and spent the night eating ice cream out of the container, while cursing Daniel's name. That was the plan. That had always been the plan for a night like this. Instead, she typed back 4 words of her own. "Who is this?" The reply came almost instantly, as if he had been waiting. "Someone who noticed you're standing outside Lorenzo's in the rain instead of going home. Someone who thinks you deserve a better night than the one you're having. My name is Nikolai. Come over, Claire. No pressure. Just a car if you want it." Claire's blood went cold. He knew her name. She hadn't given it to him. Her mind raced through the possibilities, none of them comforting. Had Daniel set this up somehow? Some twisted prank to humiliate her further? Was this some kind of scam, the beginning of something dangerous? She looked up and down the street, suddenly aware of every parked car, every shadow in every doorway. Nothing seemed out of place, just wet pavement and the distant hum of traffic 2 streets over. "How do you know my name?" she typed, her thumb pressing hard into the screen. "You told me. Well, you told Daniel. I got the message meant for him. Your name was in a photo you sent along with it, the caption still attached. I didn't go looking for it, Claire. It just came to me, same as you did." Claire's mind flashed back. She had, in her fury, attached an old photo of the 2 of them together, one from a trip to the coast 2 years ago, back when things had still felt right. Daniel's name wasn't tagged, but hers had been, an old habit from when she used to caption everything with her name, out of some strange, sentimental need to mark the memory as hers. It was a small detail, a careless one, but it explained everything. She let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She remembered that trip now, standing in the rain with her phone glowing in her hand. It had been early spring, the air still cold enough to bite, and Daniel had wrapped his jacket around her shoulders on the boardwalk, because she had forgotten to bring a coat. She had thought, in that moment, that she had found the person she would spend the rest of her life with. She had been wrong about so much since then, but she had not known it yet, not that day, not with the salt air in her hair and his laugh carrying over the sound of the waves. It was strange, she thought, how a single photograph could hold so much hope and end up meaning nothing at all. She had kept it because it made her happy. Now it had become the very thing that led her to a stranger's doorstep on the worst night of her life. There was something almost funny about that, in a bitter, exhausted sort of way. And for the first time since she had walked out of the restaurant, she felt the corner of her mouth twitch towards something like a smile. She thought of calling Grace right then, of telling her best friend everything, the cheating, the text, the reply from a stranger named Nikolai who somehow already knew her name. Grace would have told her to run home immediately and lock the door. Grace was sensible that way, always the voice of caution when Claire's heart ran ahead of her head. But some small, reckless part of Claire did not want to be talked out of this. Some part of her wanted, for once, to make a choice that had nothing to do with being careful. "I'm not going to a stranger's house," she typed. "That's insane. I don't even know you. You don't have to know me. You just have to let yourself have 1 hour where you're not thinking about him. I promise you that much. If you don't like it, my driver takes you straight home, and you never hear from me again. No pressure, no expectations, just an hour." Claire read the message 3 times. She should have said no. Every rational part of her screamed that this was reckless, that women did not go to strangers' houses because of an accidental text sent in a moment of heartbreak, that this was exactly the kind of decision people warned you about in true crime podcasts. But there was something in the calm certainty of his words that cut through the panic in her chest. Something about a man who didn't beg, didn't push, didn't try to convince her with a dozen more messages. He had made his offer once, and left the choice entirely in her hands. She thought about going home. She pictured her empty apartment, the ring Daniel had given her, still sitting in its box on her dresser, the dinner reservation she had made for their anniversary, still confirmed in her email, the whole apartment full of memories of a man who had been quietly building a second life behind her back for months. She thought about walking back inside the restaurant and throwing her water glass at Daniel's smug, unbothered face. She thought about calling Grace and crying until she had no tears left. She thought about all of it, and none of it made the ache in her chest any smaller. She thought, too, about the last 6 months, the small signs she had brushed aside because she hadn't wanted to see them, the phone he suddenly kept face down on the counter, the late nights he blamed on work that never seemed to have a name, the way he had grown distant during dinners, answering her questions with half a sentence before drifting back into his own thoughts. She had noticed all of it and told herself she was imagining things, that 6 years of love did not simply evaporate without a reason, that a man who had once memorized her coffee order without being asked would not turn into someone she didn't recognize. She had been wrong. She had been wrong for months, maybe longer. And the woman sitting across from him tonight, laughing at something he said, was proof that Claire's instincts had been right all along, and she had simply refused to listen to them. That refusal, more than anything else, was what made her angriest as she stood shivering on the sidewalk. Not the betrayal itself, but the fact that some quiet, observant part of her had known, and she had silenced it again and again to protect a version of her life that no longer existed. "Where?" she typed, before she could talk herself out of it. "A black car will be outside Lorenzo's in 10 minutes. You don't have to get in. But it will be there if you want it." Claire slipped her phone into her coat pocket and stood shivering under the awning, watching the rain fall harder now, blurring the streetlights into long streaks of gold. Through the restaurant window, she could see Daniel still sitting there, oblivious, his hand now resting over the other woman's on the table. Something in Claire's chest hardened at the sight. 6 years. 6 years of birthdays and holidays and late nights when he told her she was the only one, and this was how it ended, with her standing outside in the rain while he pretended nothing had happened at all. At exactly 10 minutes, a sleek black car rounded the corner and slowed to a stop at the curb in front of her. The windows were tinted, the paint gleaming despite the rain, the kind of car that belonged to people who never had to worry about a bill again in their life. The back door opened on its own, as though someone inside had pressed a button. Claire hesitated on the sidewalk, rain soaking through her shoes now, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. She thought of every warning her mother had ever given her about strangers, every safety lecture from every job orientation about not getting into unmarked cars. Then she thought of Daniel's laugh, drifting faintly through the restaurant glass, and she stepped forward and got into the car. Inside, it smelled like leather and something faintly like cedar. The driver, A broad man with graying hair and kind eyes glanced at her in the rearview mirror and gave her a small, respectful nod, as if this sort of thing happened all the time, and he had long since stopped being surprised by it. "Miss Whitmore," he said simply, "Mr. Volkov is expecting you." Claire's stomach twisted at the sound of her own last name in his mouth. She hadn't given that either. She wanted to ask how much this stranger already knew about her, but something about the driver's calm, professional tone made her decide the questions could wait until she saw the man himself. The car pulled away from the curb and merged smoothly into traffic, leaving the restaurant and Daniel and the life she thought she had been building behind in the rain. She watched the city lights slide past the window, feeling strangely weightless, as though she had stepped outside her own life and was now watching it happen to someone else. They drove for nearly 20 minutes, the streets growing quieter, the buildings growing taller and then shorter again, as they left downtown behind and climbed into a part of the city Claire had only ever seen from a distance, up on the hill, where the old money lived, where the houses had gates instead of doors, and security cameras instead of doorbells. Claire watched the neighborhoods change through the rain-streaked window, the crowded apartment blocks giving way to wide lawns and tall hedges, the streetlights growing further apart, until the darkness between them felt private instead of empty. She had grown up in a small house 2 hours outside the city, the kind of place where neighbors knew each other's names, and nobody locked their doors during the day. She had never imagined herself in a car like this, gliding toward a house like the ones she used to see in magazines at the dentist's office, dreaming they belonged to some other kind of person entirely. She caught the driver watching her again in the mirror, not unkindly, more like he understood exactly how strange this must feel to her. "Almost there," he said gently, as if sensing her nerves climbing with every mile. "He's not what you're expecting. Most people say that after they meet him." Claire wanted to ask what he meant by that, but something about the quiet certainty in his voice told her the answer would come soon enough, whether she asked for it or not. She turned back to the window and watched the city lights grow smaller and smaller in the distance behind them, already feeling like a different person than the one who had walked out of the restaurant less than an hour ago. The car turned through an iron gate that opened automatically as they approached, as if it had been watching for them. Claire caught a glimpse of 2 men in dark coats standing near the entrance, their eyes tracking the car's approach with the kind of alertness she had only ever seen in movies. Her pulse quickened. This was not the home of an ordinary man who happened to receive a wrong number text. This was something else entirely, something with weight and danger behind every polished surface. The driver parked in front of a large stone house, its windows glowing warm gold against the dark, rain-slicked night. He came around and opened her door, offering a hand she didn't take, too nervous to trust her own legs not to shake. "Straight through the front doors, Miss Whitmore," he said. "He's waiting in the study." Claire stepped out into the cold night air, the rain lighter now, more of a mist than a downpour. She looked up at the house, its size and grandeur making her suddenly, painfully aware of her damp coat and rain-flattened hair, of the mascara she was certain had smudged beneath her eyes hours ago. She almost turned back. She almost told the driver to take her home after all, that this had been a terrible mistake, that whatever this Nikolai wanted from her, she was not the kind of woman who went looking for trouble in strange houses on hills she had never heard of. But then the front door opened, spilling golden light onto the wet stone steps, and a man stepped into the doorway, tall and still, watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. He didn't smile. He didn't wave her forward. He simply waited, as though he had all the patience in the world and no intention of rushing her decision. Claire stood frozen at the bottom of the steps, rain misting around her, staring up at the man whose single message had pulled her out of the worst night of her life and into something she did not yet have a name for. "You came," he said, his voice low and even, carrying easily across the quiet courtyard. Claire swallowed hard, gripping the strap of her bag like it was the only solid thing left in her world. "I don't know why," she admitted, and it was the most honest thing she had said all night. Nikolai's mouth curved, just slightly, not quite a smile but something close to it. Then, "Let's find out together," he said, and stepped back to let her inside. She climbed the stone steps slowly, every instinct in her body telling her this was reckless, this was dangerous. This was the kind of decision that changed a person's life in ways they couldn't yet imagine. But her heart, still raw and bleeding from a betrayal she hadn't asked for, pushed her forward anyway. As she crossed the threshold into the warm light of the house, the heavy front door closed behind her, with a soft, final click, sealing her inside a world she knew nothing about, with a man whose name she had learned only an hour ago, and whose reply to a message that was never meant for him had already changed everything. Outside, the rain kept falling over the city below, over the restaurant where Daniel still sat, unaware that the woman he had betrayed was no longer thinking about him at all. For the first time in weeks, Claire Whitmore's mind was somewhere else entirely, caught between fear and a strange, unfamiliar thrill, standing in the front hall of a stranger's house, waiting to see what came next. The inside of the house was nothing like Claire expected. She had pictured cold marble floors and stiff furniture, the kind of place that looked beautiful in photographs but felt uncomfortable to actually live in. Instead, warm lamplight spilled across dark wood floors, and a fire crackled somewhere out of sight, filling the entrance hall with the faint smell of cedar smoke. Nikolai led her through a wide corridor lined with paintings, none of them the kind of loud, showy art she expected from a man with armed guards at his gate. They were quiet paintings, landscapes mostly, a few portraits of people who looked like they belonged to another century entirely. She wanted to ask about them, but didn't trust her voice yet, still too aware of the damp hem of her dress clinging to her legs, the mascara she was certain had smudged hours ago. He didn't rush her. He walked slightly ahead, glancing back every few steps, as though checking that she was still following, still comfortable, still willing to be there. It was such a small gesture, but it struck her as strange, coming from a man whose home had guards at the gate, and a driver who called her by her last name without being told. Before they reached the study, Claire paused in front of one of the paintings, a quiet image of a woman standing alone on a shoreline, her back turned to the viewer, the sea stretching out gray and endless in front of her. There was something about the loneliness of it that pulled at her, even in her exhausted state. Nikolai stopped beside her, following her gaze. "My mother chose most of the art in this house before she passed," he said, his voice softer than before. "She liked paintings that made you feel something, without telling you exactly what to feel. I never had the heart to change any of it after she was gone." Claire glanced at him, surprised by the small, unguarded admission. "I'm sorry," she said quietly, "about your mother." "It was a long time ago," he said, though something in his tone suggested the loss still sat close to the surface, even years later. "She would have liked you, I think. She never trusted people who smiled too easily. She said it usually meant they were hiding something." Claire didn't know what to say to that, so she said nothing, simply let the quiet moment settle between them before he gestured her onward, further down the hall toward the study. They reached a room at the end of the hall, and he pushed the door open to reveal a study filled with bookshelves that reached the ceiling, a large stone fireplace throwing warm light across a leather sofa, and tall windows that looked out over dark hills rolling away into the night. "Sit, if you'd like," he said, gesturing toward the sofa near the fire. "You look cold." Claire hesitated only a moment before crossing the room and sinking into the soft leather, grateful for the heat radiating from the fireplace. Nikolai didn't sit across from her the way she expected. Instead, he moved to a small table near the window and poured 2 glasses of something amber-colored from a crystal decanter, then crossed the room and handed one to her before settling into the armchair beside the sofa, close, but not too close. Claire wrapped both hands around the glass without drinking, studying him now that the panic of the unfamiliar house had settled into something closer to curiosity. He was younger than she expected, maybe 35, with dark hair combed back neatly, and sharp, watchful eyes that seemed to take in everything, without giving much away in return. He wore a simple dark sweater, nothing flashy, nothing that screamed wealth the way she thought a man like him might dress. "You're staring," he said, though there was no irritation in his voice, only mild amusement. Claire felt her cheeks warm. "Sorry. I'm just trying to figure out who you are. You knew my name. You knew where I was standing. That's not exactly normal for a wrong number text." Nikolai's mouth curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Would you believe me if I said I just have good instincts?" "No," Claire said honestly, and something about her bluntness seemed to please him, because his eyes warmed slightly. Fair enough, he said. I run several businesses in this city. Restaurants, mostly. Some property. Lorenzo's, where you were standing tonight, happens to be one of them. My driver was already nearby collecting the evening's receipts when your message came through. When I looked up, I saw a woman standing outside in the rain, staring at her phone like the world had just ended. It wasn't hard to put together that the message and the woman were connected. Claire blinked, feeling foolish for not considering something so simple. So you weren't watching me. You just happened to be there. I happened to be there, he agreed. What happened after that was a choice, not an accident. She turned the glass slowly in her hands, watching the amber liquid catch the firelight. And the guards at your gate? The men who look like they could break someone in half without blinking? Those are normal for a restaurant owner? Something shifted behind his eyes, brief and controlled, gone before she could name it. My family has interests beyond the restaurants, he said carefully. Older interests. I won't insult you by pretending otherwise, and I won't burden you with details you didn't ask for tonight. Tonight is not about that. Claire's stomach tightened, some instinct warning her to be careful, to ask more questions, to demand real answers before she let herself relax any further into the warmth of the fire and the strange comfort of his voice. But another part of her, the part still raw from Daniel's betrayal, was tired of demanding truth from men who only gave her half of it anyway. What is tonight about then? She asked instead. Nikolai leaned back in his chair, studying her with an expression that was somehow both patient and intense. Tonight is about an hour where you don't think about him. That's all I offered. I intend to keep that promise, if you'll let me. Claire finally took a sip of the drink, feeling the warmth spread down her throat, steadying something in her chest that had been shaking since she left the restaurant. Okay, she said quietly. 1 hour. For the next while, he asked her nothing about Daniel at all. He asked about her instead, about the small details of her life that Daniel had stopped asking about months ago. He asked what she did for work, and she told him about the small design studio where she illustrated children's books, how she had always loved drawing but never expected to make a living from it until a lucky break 3 years ago. He asked what she loved most about it, and she found herself talking for 10 straight minutes about color palettes and character sketches, more animated than she had been in weeks. He listened the way almost no one listened anymore, without checking his phone, without waiting for his turn to speak, without that distracted half-attention she had grown so used to from Daniel that she had stopped noticing it as a problem. Nikolai's eyes stayed on her the entire time, sharp and focused, as though nothing in the world mattered more in that moment than what she was saying. It unsettled her a little, how easy it was to talk to him. It unsettled her more, how much she wanted to keep talking. You're good at this, she said eventually, narrowing her eyes at him with a small, suspicious smile, making a heartbroken woman forget her problems for an hour. Is this something you do often? Nikolai's expression flickered, something almost like surprise crossing his face before he composed himself again. No, he said simply. This isn't something I do at all, actually. I don't typically respond to wrong number texts, Claire. I'm not entirely sure why I responded to yours. The honesty in his voice caught her off guard. She had expected charm, practiced lines, the kind of smooth confidence that men who looked like him and lived in houses like this usually carried around like armor. Instead, he seemed almost as unsure of himself in that moment as she felt, and something about that vulnerability made her trust him a little more than she probably should have. Maybe you felt sorry for me, she offered, standing in the rain like a wet cat. Maybe, he agreed, though his tone suggested he didn't believe that was the whole truth either. Or maybe I liked the honesty in your message. Most people don't say what they actually feel. You didn't hold anything back. There was something almost brave about that, even if you didn't mean for me to read it. Claire looked down at her glass, unexpectedly moved by the observation. Nobody had called anything about tonight brave. Mostly she felt reckless, foolish, exposed. But hearing him frame it that way, as though her raw, unfiltered grief had been a kind of strength instead of a weakness, loosened something tight in her chest that had been wound for weeks. They talked for what felt like both no time at all and much longer than an hour. He told her small things about himself in return, careful, measured pieces that felt deliberate without feeling evasive. He had grown up mostly in this city, had taken over the family businesses younger than he would have liked, after circumstances he didn't elaborate on. He loved chess, though he rarely found anyone patient enough to play a full game with him. He hated small talk at parties and avoided them whenever he could, which was one of the reasons the house on the hill stayed as quiet as it did most nights. Claire found herself relaxing into the sofa, the tension that had gripped her shoulders since she left the restaurant slowly loosening with each passing minute. The fire crackled low and steady. Somewhere in the house, a clock chimed softly, marking an hour that had clearly come and gone without either of them noticing or caring. It was nearly midnight when she finally checked her phone, more out of habit than genuine want, and found 3 missed calls from Daniel and a string of increasingly frantic texts, demanding to know where she had gone, accusing her of overreacting, insisting they needed to talk before she did something she would regret. As she stared at the messages, her phone buzzed again in her hand, Daniel's name flashing across the screen in a call this time instead of a text. Her thumb hovered over the decline button, but some old habit, some leftover reflex from 6 years of answering his calls without question, made her hesitate a moment too long. Nikolai noticed the hesitation immediately. "You don't have to answer that," he said, his voice even, though his eyes had sharpened, watching her the way a person watches a door they suspect might swing open at any moment. "I know," Claire said, but her voice wavered slightly, betraying the pull she still felt. "Even now, even after everything, 6 years doesn't just disappear because I want it to." "No," Nikolai agreed, "it doesn't. But you get to decide how much of it still gets to reach you tonight." The phone stopped buzzing on its own, the call going unanswered, and Claire felt a strange mixture of relief and guilt settle into her chest. She set the phone face down again, this time pushing it slightly further away on the table, as if the extra few inches might somehow matter. Her jaw tightened as she read them. Nikolai, watching her face change, set his glass down and leaned forward slightly. "He's found the courage to text now," he observed, his voice carefully neutral, though Claire could hear something sharper underneath it. "Now that I'm not there to see his face," Claire said bitterly, locking the screen and setting the phone face down on the table beside her. "He's very brave through a screen." Nikolai was quiet for a moment, watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "You don't have to go back tonight," he said finally. "My driver can take you anywhere else you'd like to stay. A friend's place, a hotel, anywhere. You don't owe him a conversation you're not ready to have." The offer, simple and practical as it was, meant more to Claire than she expected. Nobody had given her an easy way out of anything in weeks. Everyone in her life kept telling her what she should do, how she should feel, how quickly she should move past a betrayal that still felt fresh and raw every time she closed her eyes. Nikolai was the first person who had simply handed her a choice and stepped back to let her make it. "I think I'd like to stay a little longer here, actually," she admitted, surprising herself with the honesty of it. "If that's all right." Something warm flickered across Nikolai's face, brief but genuine. "It's more than all right," he said quietly. They talked a while longer, the conversation drifting into easier territory, favorite books, terrible childhood memories, the strange, small joys of ordinary life that Claire hadn't realized she missed sharing with someone until she was sharing them now. For the first time in what felt like months, she laughed without forcing it, a real, surprised sound that seemed to catch Nikolai off guard in the best possible way. She told him about the time she had tried to teach herself to ride a bicycle at 11 years old and ended up crashing into her neighbor's garden shed, breaking 3 clay pots and terrifying an elderly cat that never came near her again. He told her, in return, about learning chess from his grandfather at 6 years old, how the old man had refused to let him win a single game until he was nearly 10, insisting that a boy who won too easily would never learn to think 3 steps ahead of anyone. "You still play?" she asked, curious despite herself. "Every week," he said, "though I've had to find new opponents over the years. Most people don't enjoy losing as much as my grandfather thought they should learn to." Claire laughed again, surprising herself with how easily it came now, how far away Daniel's laughter through the restaurant window felt after just a few hours in this quiet, firelit room. "Maybe you just need better opponents," she teased. "Maybe I do," Nikolai said, watching her with an expression that made her stomach flutter in a way she hadn't expected and wasn't entirely sure she was ready for. But even as the warmth of the evening wrapped around her, she couldn't fully shake the awareness sitting quietly at the edges of her mind. The guards outside, the careful way he had avoided certain questions about his family's business, the driver who had known her name before she gave it. Whatever kindness Nikolai was offering her tonight existed alongside something darker, something with real weight and real danger, behind the warm lamplight and the crackling fire. She didn't ask about it again that night. She told herself there would be time for those questions later, if there was a later at all. For now, she let herself simply exist in the strange, unexpected comfort of a stranger's study, wrapped in warmth she hadn't felt in far too long, choosing for once not to think too hard about what it might cost her. When the driver finally took her home in the early hours of the morning, the city quiet and washed clean by the earlier rain, Claire sat in the back seat replaying the entire night in her mind, still faintly disbelieving that any of it had actually happened. She thought of Nikolai's steady voice, his careful attention, the strange mixture of danger and gentleness that seemed to live in him at once. She didn't know yet how deeply that mixture would come to define the months ahead of her, or how soon the world outside that warm, firelit study would come looking for her, demanding answers she didn't yet have. For tonight, she simply held on to the memory of laughing again, of feeling seen again, and let that be enough. Daniel Ashford was pounding on Claire's apartment door before she had even finished her first cup of coffee the next morning. She heard his voice through the wood, loud and desperate in a way that would have terrified her a year ago, back when she still believed his moods were something she needed to manage carefully to keep the peace. "Claire, open the door. We need to talk about this. You can't just disappear on me like that." Claire stood frozen in her kitchen, mug halfway to her lips, staring at the door as though it might splinter open under the force of his fists. Her phone sat on the counter beside her, still full of his unanswered messages from the night before, each one more frantic than the last. She thought about Nikolai's calm voice from the night before, the way he had told her she didn't owe Daniel a conversation she wasn't ready to have. She held on to that thought as she crossed the small apartment and pressed her palm flat against the door, not opening it. "Go home, Daniel," she called through the wood, proud of how steady her voice sounded, despite the way her hands were shaking. "There's nothing left to talk about. I saw everything I needed to see last night." "It's not what you think," he shouted back, his voice cracking with something that might have been genuine desperation, or might simply have been the panic of a man realizing he was about to lose everything he had built his comfortable life around. "Claire, please, 6 years. Doesn't that mean anything to you?" "It meant everything to me," Claire said, and her voice broke slightly, despite her best efforts to keep it even. "That's exactly the problem, Daniel. It meant everything to me, and apparently nothing to you." There was a long pause on the other side of the door, followed by the sound of his fist hitting the wood once, hard enough that Claire flinched back a step. "Open the door," he said again, quieter now, but with an edge underneath it that made the hair on the back of her neck rise. "I'm not leaving until you open this door and talk to me like an adult." Claire's heart pounded. She had never heard that particular tone in his voice before, not in 6 years, not even during their worst arguments. It frightened her more than she wanted to admit, standing alone in her apartment, with nothing but a locked door between them. She grabbed her phone off the counter with trembling hands, and, without fully deciding to do it, opened her messages, and typed a single line to the number that had changed her life less than 12 hours earlier. "He's outside my door, and he won't leave." The reply came within seconds, faster than she expected, as though he had been watching his phone the entire time. "Address?" She sent it without hesitation, some instinct telling her that whatever came next would be better than facing Daniel's fists on the door alone. "Stay away from the door," the next message read. "Don't open it until I tell you it's safe." Claire backed away from the door and sank onto her couch, phone clutched tightly in both hands, listening to Daniel's continued pleading and pounding through the thin apartment walls. It felt like an eternity, though her phone told her it had only been 11 minutes, before she heard a car pull up outside, followed by the sound of a door closing and unfamiliar footsteps approaching her building. The pounding on her door stopped abruptly. She heard Daniel's voice change, the desperate edge replaced by something wary and confused. "Who are you?" he demanded, though his voice had lost most of its earlier bravado. Claire crept closer to the door, pressing her ear against the wood, straining to hear the low, even voice that answered him. "A friend of Claire's," Nikolai said, his tone calm in a way that somehow felt more threatening than shouting ever could. "I think it's time you left." "This isn't your business," Daniel snapped back, though Claire could hear the uncertainty creeping into his words now, the way his confidence wavered against Nikolai's unshakable calm. "She's my fiancée. We're working through something." Claire winced at the word fiancé, feeling a fresh wave of anger rise in her chest even through the fear of the confrontation happening just outside her door. "I don't think she sees it that way anymore," Nikolai said, his voice never rising, never losing its measured steadiness. "And I'd strongly suggest you leave before this becomes a conversation you don't want to have." There was a long, tense silence. Claire held her breath, one hand pressed flat against the door, imagining every possible way this could go wrong. Daniel had never been a violent man, not exactly, but she had never seen him this unraveled either, and she had no idea what a cornered, humiliated man might do when faced with someone who clearly wasn't intimidated by him. Finally, Daniel's voice came again, quieter this time, tinged with something that sounded almost like fear. "Who exactly do you think you are?" he asked. "Someone who knows your name, your workplace, and the fact that you've been seeing Miranda Ellery for the better part of 4 months. Nikolai said, each word deliberate and precise, like a man laying cards on a table one at a time. "I'd think very carefully about whether you want to keep standing outside this door, or whether you'd rather go home and consider how much of your life you're willing to lose over a decision you've already made twice." Claire's breath caught in her throat. She hadn't told Nikolai the other woman's name. She hadn't told him anything beyond the barest details of what had happened the night before. The realization that he already knew far more than she had shared sent a fresh chill through her, equal parts unsettling and, strangely, reassuring. There was no response from Daniel beyond the sound of retreating footsteps, quick and uneven, followed by a car door slamming somewhere down the street, and an engine revving away too fast for the quiet residential road. Claire remained frozen against her door for a long moment, after the sound faded completely, waiting to see if he would return. He knocked softly this time, just once. "It's safe now," Nikolai said through the door. "He's gone." Claire opened the door slowly, still shaking slightly from the adrenaline of the last 20 minutes. Nikolai stood on her small landing, dressed simply again, no guards visible behind him this time, just him standing alone in the pale morning light, his expression unreadable. "How did you know about Miranda?" Claire asked, her voice smaller than she intended. Nikolai's expression flickered, something almost apologetic crossing his face. "I looked into him last night, after you left," he admitted. "I wanted to know who I was potentially dealing with, in case he decided to make things difficult for you. I probably should have asked before digging into his life, and I'm sorry if that crosses a line you didn't invite me to cross." Claire considered being angry about the invasion of privacy, considered pointing out that she barely knew this man well enough to have him investigating her ex-fiancé's personal life without her permission. But standing there in the aftermath of Daniel's frightening visit, she found she couldn't summon the anger. Instead, gratitude and unease tangled together in her chest, impossible to fully separate from each other. "Thank you," she said finally, "for coming. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't." Nikolai's jaw tightened slightly. "He wouldn't have hurt you," he said, though something in his voice suggested he wasn't entirely certain of that himself. "Men like that rarely follow through on the anger they show at the door, but I wasn't willing to take that chance with you." Claire studied him for a long moment, taking in the quiet intensity behind his careful, controlled exterior. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "And I need you to actually answer me this time, not just give me half a truth wrapped in something reassuring." Nikolai nodded once, his expression steady. "Ask. What exactly are you?" Claire said. "Last night you said your family had interests beyond the restaurants. This morning you knew things about Daniel that would have taken days to find through normal means. I need to know what I'm actually involved in here, Nikolai. I can't keep pretending I don't notice the things that don't add up." Nikolai was quiet for a long moment, his eyes searching her face, as though weighing exactly how much truth she could handle standing in her doorway on a cold morning, still shaken from her ex-fiancé's visit. Finally he spoke, his voice low and even. "My family has run parts of this city for 3 generations, he said. Not the parts you'd want to bring up at dinner parties. We deal in things that exist outside the law, Claire, and we protect our own interests in ways that don't always look clean from the outside. I inherited that world whether I wanted it or not, and most days, I've made my peace with what that means. Claire's stomach dropped, though some part of her had already suspected as much, since the moment she saw the guards at his gate. So you're dangerous, she said quietly, not quite a question. To the people who cross me, yes, Nikolai said, without hesitation, without flinching from the truth of it. To you, never. That's a promise I intend to keep, whether or not you decide you want anything more to do with me after this conversation. Claire wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly cold despite standing in the doorway of her own heated apartment. She should have been afraid. Every rational instinct told her to close the door, thank him for his help, and never answer another message from that number again. But she thought of Daniel's fist against her door, of the fear that had gripped her chest until Nikolai's calm voice cut through it. She thought of the warmth of the fireplace the night before, the way he had listened to her without distraction, the way he had asked nothing of her except an hour of her time, and had somehow given her far more than that in return. I need time to think about all of this, she said finally, and it was the truth, plain and unadorned. Take whatever time you need, Nikolai said. I'm not going anywhere, Claire, but I understand if you decide this isn't a world you want any part of. He left shortly after, his car pulling away down the quiet street, leaving Claire standing alone in her doorway, with far more questions than answers, and a strange, persistent warmth in her chest that refused to be talked out of existence, no matter how many reasons her mind produced for why it probably should. She closed the door and locked it, then locked it again, checking the bolt twice before finally allowing herself to sink onto the couch, her legs suddenly unsteady beneath her. The adrenaline of the morning was fading now, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion that made even lifting her phone feel like an effort. She called Grace anyway, because some habits ran deeper than exhaustion. Her best friend picked up on the second ring, already talking before Claire could get a word out. "Where have you been?" Grace demanded. "I called you 4 times last night. Daniel called me too, asking if I knew where you went. What happened at the restaurant?" Claire took a breath and told her everything. The cheating, the wrong number text, the house on the hill, Daniel's visit that morning, and the calm, controlled way Nikolai had made him leave. She left nothing out, needing to hear it all spoken aloud to someone who knew her, someone who might be able to tell her whether she had lost her mind completely. Grace was quiet for a long moment after Claire finished, long enough that Claire checked the screen to make sure the call hadn't dropped. "Say something," Claire said. "I'm processing," Grace admitted. "You met a Mafia boss because you texted the wrong number, and instead of blocking him, you went to his house, and now he's scaring off your cheating ex-fiancé like some kind of guardian devil. That's a lot to process before 10 in the morning, Claire. When you say it like that, it sounds insane," Claire said, dropping her head back against the couch cushion. "It sounds insane because it is insane," Grace said, though her voice had softened, losing its edge of alarm. "But I heard your voice just now, talking about him. I haven't heard you sound like that in months, not even before you found out about Daniel. You sounded tired all the time, even when things were supposedly fine between you two." Claire hadn't realized how true that was, until Grace said it aloud. She thought back over the last several months with Daniel, the quiet exhaustion that had settled over every conversation, the sense that she was always performing contentment rather than actually feeling it. She hadn't noticed how heavy that performance had become until the weight of it had lifted, if only for a single evening. "I don't know what to do," Claire admitted. "He told me exactly what he is, Grace. He didn't try to hide it or soften it. He said his family runs parts of the city that don't look clean from the outside. That should terrify me. It does terrify me. But it doesn't scare me enough to stop thinking about him." Grace sighed on the other end of the line, a long, considering sound. "I can't tell you what to do with your life," she said finally. "I can tell you that most men who could hurt you don't bother warning you first. That's not nothing, Claire. Dangerous and dishonest are 2 different things, even if they end up looking similar from a distance. Just be careful, go slow, and call me every single day so I know you're still breathing." Claire managed a small, tired laugh, the first genuine one since Daniel had started pounding on her door hours earlier. "I promise," she said. They talked a while longer, Grace asking careful questions about the house, about the guards, about whether Claire actually felt safe or simply overwhelmed in a way that mimicked safety. Claire answered as honestly as she could, surprised by how much clearer her own feelings became, simply by trying to explain them aloud to someone who loved her enough to worry. After they hung up, Claire spent the rest of the afternoon trying to distract herself with work, sitting at her small desk by the window with a half-finished illustration for a children's book about a fox who was afraid of thunderstorms. She managed only a few uneven pencil strokes before setting the tablet aside, unable to focus with her mind circling back again and again to the morning's events. She thought about the way Daniel's confidence had crumbled the moment Nikolai spoke, how quickly 6 years of engagement had dissolved into nothing more than a name he was too afraid to keep repeating. She thought about Miranda Ellery, a name she had never heard before that morning, now permanently attached to the ending of her relationship. She wondered, briefly and bitterly, whether Daniel was with her right now, already spinning some new version of events where he was the wronged party. She thought too about Nikolai's face when he admitted what his family truly was, the careful, deliberate honesty of it, the way he hadn't tried to make it sound better than it was. "Dangerous to the people who cross me, never to you." The words kept circling back through her mind, refusing to settle into either comfort or fear alone, existing instead in some uneasy space between the two. By early evening, her phone buzzed with a message from an unfamiliar number, though she recognized it instantly as Nikolai's. No pressure to respond. "I just wanted to say I hope today settled quietly for you, after everything, and I meant what I said this morning. I'm not going anywhere, whatever you decide." Claire stared at the message for a long time before finally typing back a reply, her thumb hovering uncertainly over the screen, before she finally let herself send it. "Dinner, tomorrow. Somewhere that isn't your study or my apartment. I want to see how you act somewhere that isn't already yours." The reply came within seconds, and Claire could almost hear the smile in it before he even wrote the words. "Done. I'll pick the place. You'll like it, I promise." Claire set the phone down and allowed herself, finally, to smile. A real one this time, unclouded by fear or exhaustion, or the lingering echo of Daniel's fists against her door. Whatever came next, whatever danger might exist quietly beneath the surface of Nikolai's careful, controlled world, she found she wasn't ready to walk away from it yet. Not tonight. Maybe not for a long time. The man following Claire had been 3 steps behind her since she left the small grocery store on the corner of her street, and she noticed him the way she noticed most things now, with a heightened awareness she hadn't possessed a month ago, before her life had quietly folded itself around a man whose world came with its own set of dangers. She didn't turn around immediately. Instead, she quickened her pace slightly, watching his reflection in the darkened window of a closed bakery as she passed, confirming what her instincts had already told her. He matched her speed exactly, close enough to reach her in seconds if he wanted to, far enough to maintain the pretense of coincidence if she confronted him. Her hand tightened around the grocery bag, heart pounding as she calculated the distance to her apartment building, still 2 full blocks away. She thought of pulling out her phone, of calling Nikolai the way she had during Daniel's visit weeks earlier, but something told her that reaching for her phone now might provoke exactly the reaction she was trying to avoid. She turned the corner sharply instead, cutting through a narrow alley she knew connected to a busier street, one with enough foot traffic that whatever this man intended would become considerably harder to carry out unnoticed. Her breath came fast and shallow as she walked, every sound behind her amplified by fear into something far more threatening than it likely was. A hand closed around her arm just as she reached the mouth of the alley, spinning her around before she could scream. The man was older than she expected, weathered and grim-faced, his grip firm but not violent, as though he had been trained to restrain without harming. "Tell your friend Nikolai that Victor Bellamy sends his regards," the man said, his voice low and controlled, carrying none of Daniel's earlier desperate anger. "This is just a reminder that everyone he cares about is reachable. Tell him to remember that the next time he thinks about expanding into territory that isn't his." Before Claire could respond, could even fully process the threat wrapped inside those carefully chosen words, The man released her arm and disappeared back down the alley, moving with the unhurried confidence of someone who knew exactly how much time he had before anyone would think to follow. Claire stood frozen for several long seconds, her grocery bag forgotten on the ground where it had fallen, before her hands finally found her phone with trembling fingers. She called Nikolai directly this time, not bothering with a text, needing to hear his voice more than she needed to type out an explanation. He answered on the first ring. "Claire, what's wrong?" he said immediately, some instinct in him apparently already sensing something was off before she said a word. "A man grabbed me," she said, her voice shaking despite her best efforts to keep it steady. "He said his name was Victor Bellamy. He said to tell you everyone you care about is reachable. He said something about you expanding into territory that isn't yours." There was a silence on the other end of the line, so complete and so sudden that for a moment Claire wondered if the call had dropped. When Nikolai finally spoke again, his voice had changed entirely, stripped of its usual warmth, replaced by something cold and precise that made her skin prickle. "Where are you right now, exactly?" he asked. She told him, and within minutes, faster than should have been possible, a car pulled up at the mouth of the alley, two of his men stepping out before it had fully stopped moving. They flanked her without a word, escorting her into the back seat with quiet, practiced efficiency, and the car pulled away before she had even managed to catch her breath. Nikolai was waiting for her at the house on the hill, standing in the doorway the same way he had the very first night she arrived, though everything about his posture now radiated a barely contained tension that had been entirely absent before. He crossed the courtyard the moment the car stopped, pulling her door open himself before the driver could reach it. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his hands hovering near her shoulders, as though he wanted to check for himself, but wasn't certain she would welcome the touch. "I'm fine," Claire said, though her voice still trembled slightly. "Scared, but fine. Nikolai, who is Victor Bellamy?" Nikolai's jaw tightened, and for the first time since she had known him, she saw something flicker behind his controlled expression that looked almost like fear, quickly buried beneath a colder, more familiar resolve. "Come inside," he said. "I owe you the full truth now. I should have told you sooner, before it put you in danger." Inside the study, the fire already lit as though he had been expecting to need its warmth, Nikolai finally laid out the pieces he had kept carefully hidden during their previous conversations. Victor Bellamy ran a rival organization on the east side of the city, one that had spent the last 2 years slowly encroaching on territory Nikolai's family had controlled for generations. Tensions had been rising for months, small confrontations escalating gradually towards something neither side had yet been willing to call outright conflict. "I didn't want to bring you into this part of my world," Nikolai said, pacing slowly in front of the fireplace, his usual stillness replaced by restless, controlled energy. "I told myself I could keep the two separate, that you could exist in the part of my life that involves warmth and dinner, and quiet evenings, without ever touching the part that involves men like Victor. I was wrong, and now you've paid for that mistake." "I'm not paying for anything," Claire said firmly, surprising herself with the strength in her own voice. "I'm scared, Nikolai, but I'm not fragile. I want to understand what I'm actually facing here, not be protected from the truth like I can't handle it." Nikolai stopped pacing and looked at her for a long moment, something in his expression softening slightly, despite the tension still radiating from his shoulders. "You remind me of my mother when you say things like that," he said quietly. "She never let my father shield her from anything either, even when it would have been easier for everyone if she had." Claire held his gaze steadily. "Tell me everything," she said. "From the beginning. I want to know what I'm choosing, if I choose to stay in this." And so he did. He told her about his father's death 8 years earlier, the sudden violent circumstances that had forced Nikolai to take control of the family's operations far younger than he had ever intended, thrust into a role he had spent his childhood specifically trying to avoid. He told her about the years since, the careful balance he had maintained between the family's legitimate businesses and the older, darker obligations that came with the name he carried. The constant vigilance required to protect the people who depended on him without becoming the kind of man his enemies already assumed he was. He told her, too, about the growing conflict with Victor Bellamy, how it had started as minor territorial disputes and escalated gradually over the past year into something far more dangerous, Threats exchanged through intermediaries. Warehouses burned. A cousin of his badly hurt in an altercation 3 months earlier that Nikolai had kept largely quiet, even from his own closest allies. I almost didn't reply to your text that first night, he admitted, his voice dropping lower, more vulnerable than she had ever heard it. I was in the middle of a call about exactly this conflict when your message came through. I told myself I didn't have time for distractions, that whatever was happening with the wrong number wasn't my concern. And then I read what you wrote, how raw it was, how much pain was packed into those few lines, and something in me simply couldn't ignore it. I don't fully understand why, even now. Claire felt something in her chest tighten at the admission, moved despite the fear still coursing through her from the afternoon's encounter. Maybe you needed a distraction more than you realized, she offered quietly. Maybe, Nikolai agreed, though his expression remained troubled. But that distraction has now put you directly in Victor's sights, and I won't forgive myself easily if something happens to you because of choices I made. Over the following days, Claire's world narrowed considerably. Guards now a constant presence, whether she was at her apartment or at the house on the hill. Her movements tracked and escorted in ways that felt suffocating, even as she understood the necessity behind them. Nikolai grew quieter, more focused, spending long hours in meetings she wasn't invited to. His phone constantly buzzing with updates she could see troubled him, even when he tried to hide it from her. Grace came to visit on the third day, driven over by one of Nikolai's men, after Claire insisted she needed at least one face from her old life, to remind her the rest of the world was still turning normally, somewhere outside these walls. Grace took one look at the guard posted near the front gate, and raised an eyebrow so high it nearly disappeared into her hairline. "This is a lot," Grace said, settling onto the sofa in the study, glancing around at the tall bookshelves, and the fire crackling steadily, even in the middle of the afternoon. "You said danger, Claire, but I don't think I understood what that word actually meant, until I saw a man with an earpiece standing outside like this was a movie set." "It's real," Claire admitted, curling her legs beneath her on the other end of the sofa. "Scarier than I let myself think about most days. But Grace, I need you to understand something. I've never felt as protected as I do here, even with everything that's happened. Nikolai hasn't let anything touch me since that day in the alley, and I believe him when he says he won't." Grace studied her for a long moment, her expression caught somewhere between worry and reluctant understanding. "You love him," she said finally, not quite a question. Claire hesitated, surprised by how quickly the answer rose in her chest, unbidden and certain in a way nothing about Daniel had ever felt, even at the best of their 6 years together. "I think I do," she admitted quietly. "It terrifies me how fast it happened. But yes, Grace, I love him." Grace reached over and squeezed her hand, some of the worry in her expression softening into something gentler. "Then I hope he's worth it," she said, "because you deserve someone who protects you like this, and actually means it, not someone who only shows up brave when there's an audience watching." They spent the rest of the afternoon together, Grace slowly relaxing as the hours passed, asking careful questions about Nikolai that Claire answered as honestly as she could, grateful for the normalcy of her best friend's company, even in the middle of everything else pressing down around her. By the time Grace left, promising to visit again soon, Claire felt steadier than she had in days, anchored by the reminder that her old life, messy and ordinary as it was, still existed somewhere alongside this strange new one. That evening, Nikolai returned from another long meeting, looking more exhausted than she had yet seen him, dark circles forming beneath his eyes, his usual composed posture slightly bent under the weight of everything he was carrying. Claire didn't ask him for details he clearly didn't want to share. Instead, she simply pulled him toward the sofa and made him sit, bringing him a plate of the dinner she had made herself in his kitchen, insisting he eat something before collapsing entirely from exhaustion. "You don't have to take care of me," he said, though he ate anyway, watching her with an expression of quiet, surprised gratitude. "Someone has to," Claire said simply. "You've spent the last week taking care of me. It's my turn." The confrontation, when it finally came, happened faster than either of them expected. Word reached Nikolai late one evening that Victor had moved against one of the family's warehouses directly, a bold escalation that demanded immediate response. Claire watched him transform in front of her, The warmth she had come to rely on replaced by something harder, more calculating, a man preparing to protect everything and everyone under his care, by whatever means necessary. The call came just after 9, one of his men bursting into the study without bothering to knock first, his face tight with urgency. Nikolai rose from his chair instantly, his entire posture shifting into something sharper, more alert. Years of experience apparently taking over before he had even finished hearing the full report. Claire watched the transformation happen in real time, startled by how quickly gentleness could give way to something colder when circumstances demanded it. He turned to her before following his man out of the room, his expression softening for just a moment, despite the urgency pressing at his back. "I need you to trust me right now," he said. "I know this is frightening. I know you didn't ask for any of this when you sent that text. But I need to go, and I need to know you'll stay here where my people can keep you safe." Claire nodded, throat too tight for words, though she managed to catch his hand before he turned away completely. "Come back to me," she said, the words barely above a whisper. "I will," he promised, pressing a brief, firm kiss to her knuckles before he strode from the room, his men falling into step behind him, with the practiced efficiency of soldiers who had done this before and would do it again. She wanted to beg him not to go, to find some other way, but she recognized the futility of that request even as it formed in her mind. This was who he was, the reality beneath the gentle evenings and careful conversations, and she had chosen to stay, knowing that reality existed, even if she hadn't fully understood its weight until now. "Stay here," he told her before he left, his hands framing her face gently despite the urgency radiating from every other part of him. "Whatever happens tonight, stay here, where you're safe. I will come back to you, Claire. I promise you that." She watched his car disappear down the long driveway, swallowed quickly by darkness, and spent the longest hours of her life waiting in the study, where they had first truly talked, the fire burning low, her phone clutched tightly in her hands, praying for a message that would tell her he was safe. When he finally returned, near dawn, exhausted but unharmed, the conflict resolved through means he refused to fully describe to her that night. Claire crossed the room and wrapped her arms around him without a single word, holding on as though letting go might somehow undo the relief flooding through her chest. Nikolai held her back just as tightly, his face buried in her hair, both of them silent for a long moment, simply grateful to still have each other standing in the same room. "It's over," he murmured eventually. "Victor won't be a problem again. You're safe now, Claire. I promise you that." Claire pulled back just enough to look up at him, exhaustion and relief tangled together on both their faces. "I believe you," she said softly. "But I need you to understand something too. I'm not going anywhere, Nikolai. Not because of tonight, and not because of whatever comes next either. I chose this. I choose you, danger and all." Something in Nikolai's expression broke open at her words, years of careful control softening into something raw and unguarded that she had never seen from him before. He pulled her close again, pressing a kiss to her forehead, and for the first time since Victor's man had grabbed her arm in that alley days earlier, Claire finally allowed herself to believe that the worst of the danger had truly passed. 3 weeks after Victor Bellamy's name disappeared entirely from Nikolai's tense phone calls, Claire stood in her apartment, surrounded by half-packed boxes, staring at the life she had built here, trying to decide how much of it she was ready to leave behind. Daniel's ring sat in its small velvet box on top of the dresser, exactly where it had been for weeks, untouched since the night everything changed. She picked it up now, turning it over in her fingers, feeling nothing but a distant, hollow sort of closure, where months of hurt used to live. She dropped it into an envelope, wrote his address on the front, without a single note included, and set it aside to mail later that day. There was nothing left to say to him that hadn't already been said in the silence of the months since. Her phone buzzed on the counter, a message from Nikolai lighting up the screen. "Dinner tonight. My place. I have something I want to ask you." Claire smiled despite the exhaustion of packing, typing back a quick reply before returning to the boxes surrounding her. Something in his message felt different from his usual casual invitations, a certain weight behind the words that made her stomach flutter with anticipation she couldn't quite explain. The weeks since the confrontation with Victor had changed things between them. deepened them in ways Claire hadn't expected when she first climbed into that black car outside Lorenzo's, soaked from the rain, and running from a heartbreak she thought would define her for months to come. Nikolai had grown less guarded with her, sharing pieces of his world she suspected he had never shared with anyone outside his immediate family, trusting her with details about his business, his history, his fears, in a way that felt like being handed something fragile and precious. She had, in turn, found herself falling deeper into a life she never could have imagined a few months earlier. The guards no longer startled her. The quiet tension that sometimes crossed Nikolai's face during business calls no longer frightened her the way it once had, replaced instead by a steady understanding of the world he moved through, and the careful, deliberate way he worked to keep that world from touching the people he loved. She had told him she loved him for the first time 2 weeks earlier, the words slipping out unplanned during a quiet evening by the fire, and the look on his face when he heard them, stunned and unguarded in a way she had rarely seen from him, had told her everything she needed to know about how deeply he felt the same, even before he said it back. Before leaving her apartment, Claire had called Grace one last time, needing to hear her best friend's voice before whatever the evening held. "I have a feeling about tonight," she admitted, standing in front of her mirror, smoothing down the front of her dress with nervous hands. "A good feeling or a bad feeling?" Grace asked, her voice carrying the particular alertness of someone who had spent the last several months worrying about her friend from a careful distance. "A good one," Claire said, surprising herself with how certain she felt saying it aloud. "I think he's going to ask me something important tonight, Grace. I can feel it in the way he's been acting all week, careful and nervous, in a way that doesn't match him at all." Grace was quiet for a moment. "And how do you feel about that?" she asked finally, her tone gentler now, all business set aside. Claire looked at her own reflection, taking in the woman staring back at her, steadier and more certain than she had been in months, maybe years. "Ready," she said simply. "I feel ready, Grace. For the first time in a long time, I actually know what I want." "Then go," Grace said, and Claire could hear the smile in her voice even through the phone. "Call me the second anything happens. I mean it, the second." Claire promised she would, laughing as she hung up, the nervous energy in her chest settling into something calmer, something closer to certainty than she had expected to feel, walking into an evening she didn't yet know the shape of. That evening, she arrived at the house on the hill dressed carefully, some instinct telling her tonight mattered more than their usual quiet dinners together. The driver greeted her with his familiar respectful nod, though tonight, there was something almost knowing in his expression, a small smile he didn't quite manage to hide. Nikolai was waiting for her at the door, the same way he had been the very first night, except everything about him now felt different, familiar and warm instead of mysterious and guarded. He took her hand as she climbed the stone steps, pulling her close for a kiss before she had even fully crossed the threshold. "You look beautiful," he murmured against her hair. "You said you had something to ask me," Claire said, unable to fully hide the nervous excitement bubbling beneath her calm exterior. "Patience," he said, though his eyes were bright with something that looked almost like nerves of his own, an expression she had rarely seen from a man who usually moved through the world with such steady, controlled confidence. He led her through the house, past the paintings his mother had chosen, past the study where they had first truly talked, out through a set of doors at the back of the house Claire had never noticed before, opening onto a wide stone terrace, overlooking the dark hills rolling away beneath a clear, star-scattered sky. Small lanterns lined the terrace railing, their warm light flickering gently in the evening breeze, and a table had been set for two beneath the open sky, candles burning steadily despite the light wind. Claire stopped in the doorway, momentarily speechless at the sight of it, the quiet, deliberate beauty of everything he had clearly arranged with careful attention. "Nikolai," she started, but he simply took her hand again, leading her out onto the terrace without a word. They ate slowly, the conversation easy and warm, drifting through small updates about her work, a new book she had started illustrating, and his own cautious optimism about the peace that had settled over the city since Victor's departure from the territory disputes that had once threatened everything Nikolai cared about. But throughout the meal, Claire noticed a certain restlessness beneath his usual calm, his hand occasionally drifting to his jacket pocket before pulling away again, as though reconsidering something each time. Finally, as the last of the candles burned low and the stars overhead grew brighter against the darkening sky, Nikolai set down his glass and reached across the table to take her hand properly, his thumb tracing slow, absent circles across her knuckles. "I've thought a great deal about that first night," he said quietly, his eyes steady on hers despite the nerves she could still sense beneath his composed exterior. "About how close I came to ignoring your message entirely. How different both our lives would look right now, if I had simply gone back to my meeting and let a wrong number fade into nothing, the way it should have." Claire's heart pounded, sensing where this was heading, not quite daring to hope for it fully until the words actually left his mouth. "I didn't ignore it," he continued, "and every day since, I've been more grateful for that than I know how to properly express. You walked into my life during the worst night of your own, and somehow, impossibly, you've become the best part of mine. I don't want an accident to be the only reason we found each other, Claire. I want it to be a choice, made deliberately, every single day from now on." He rose from his chair and knelt beside her, pulling a small velvet box from his jacket pocket, his hands steadier now that the words had finally started, as though the hardest part had already passed. Claire's breath caught entirely, her free hand pressing against her chest as though she could physically hold her racing heart in place. "Marry me," Nikolai said simply, opening the box to reveal a ring far more beautiful than anything she had ever imagined for herself, elegant and understated in exactly the way that suited him. "Not because you sent a text meant for someone else. Because I choose you, fully and completely, knowing everything about the world you'd be choosing alongside me. Come over. I told you that first night. I meant it as an offer for one evening. I mean it now as an offer for the rest of both our lives, if you'll have me." Claire's eyes filled with tears, the weight of everything that had happened since that rain-soaked night outside Lorenzo's crashing over her all at once, the heartbreak and fear and danger and, threaded through all of it, this steady, unexpected love that had grown from the most unlikely beginning imaginable. "Yes," she said, barely above a whisper before repeating it louder, laughing through her tears. "Yes, Nikolai, 1,000 times yes." He slid the ring onto her finger with hands that trembled slightly, despite his usual steadiness, then rose and pulled her into his arms, kissing her deeply beneath the wide, star-filled sky, the lanterns flickering warmly around them, the entire world narrowed down to just the two of them standing together on that quiet terrace. Later, wrapped in his arms as they looked out over the dark hills stretching toward the city lights in the distance, Claire thought back to the woman she had been that rainy night, standing outside a restaurant window, watching her entire future collapse in front of her. She could never have imagined, in that moment of raw heartbreak, that a single wrong number would lead her here, to a terrace overlooking a city that no longer felt unfamiliar, in the arms of a man who had promised to protect her from the very first message he ever sent. "I used to think losing Daniel was the worst thing that could have happened to me," she said quietly, resting her head against Nikolai's shoulder. "Now I think it might have been the best. If I hadn't sent that text, I never would have found you." Nikolai pressed a kiss to the top of her head, his arms tightening gently around her. "Then I suppose we owe him a strange sort of thanks," he murmured, humor threading through the words despite everything. Claire laughed softly, the sound carrying out over the quiet hills. "Don't push it," she said, smiling against his chest. They stood together for a long while after that, wrapped in comfortable silence beneath the stars, two people who had found each other through the smallest, most accidental of mistakes, and built something neither of them had expected from the wreckage of a single rainy night. Whatever challenges still waited for them in the world Nikolai moved through, whatever dangers might someday test the promise he had made to always protect her, Claire found she was no longer afraid to face them at his side. Later that night, once Nikolai had walked her back inside and the terrace lanterns had been left flickering gently behind them, Claire finally remembered her promise to Grace and pulled out her phone with trembling, delighted hands. She barely managed to type out a single word before hitting call instead, unable to wait for a written reply. Grace answered on the first ring, as though she had been sitting by the phone the entire evening waiting. "Well?" she demanded immediately. No greeting at all. "Tell me everything." Claire laughed, holding up her hand instinctively to admire the ring catching the hallway light, even though Grace couldn't see it through the phone. "He asked," she said, her voice thick with happiness. "Grace, he asked me to marry him." Grace's scream of delight was loud enough that Claire had to pull the phone away from her ear, laughing harder now, tears of joy slipping freely down her cheeks. "Details," Grace demanded once she had calmed down slightly. "I want every single detail, starting from the moment you walked through his front door." Claire spent the next half hour recounting the entire evening, while Nikolai watched her from across the room with a soft, indulgent smile, clearly amused by her enthusiasm, even as he pretended to busy himself pouring 2 glasses of something to celebrate. When she finally hung up, promising to bring Grace along to help plan absolutely everything, she turned to find him watching her with an expression of quiet, complete contentment. "I take it she approves," he said, crossing the room to hand her a glass. "She approves enormously," Claire said, accepting the glass and leaning into him, as his arm wrapped naturally around her shoulders. "Though she made me promise she gets to help pick the venue. I think she's already planning the whole thing in her head." "Then we'll need a very large house for the wedding," Nikolai said dryly, though warmth colored every word, and Claire laughed again, the sound easy and light in a way it hadn't been in longer than she cared to remember. She had come to him first as a stranger, drawn by 5 simple words meant to pull her out of heartbreak for just 1 hour. She stayed because somewhere in that first quiet evening by the fire, in the careful, deliberate way he had listened to her when no one else had bothered to in months, she had found something far more lasting than a distraction from her pain. She had found a home she never expected to look for, in a man she never expected to trust, and standing beside him now beneath the wide-open sky, ring gleaming softly on her finger, Claire Whitmore had never felt more certain of anything in her entire life. The next morning, Claire woke early, sunlight spilling gently through the tall windows of the room that had slowly become as familiar to her as her own apartment over the past several weeks. Nikolai was still asleep beside her, his usual careful composure softened entirely in sleep, and she took a quiet moment, simply to watch him, still faintly disbelieving that any of this belonged to her now. She slipped out of bed carefully, careful not to wake him, and wandered down to the kitchen to make coffee, still wearing his sweater over her own clothes from the night before, the ring catching the morning light every time she moved her hand. The house felt different this morning, warmer somehow, as though it had finally fully accepted her as something more than a guest passing through its halls. She thought about the boxes still waiting in her apartment, half-packed and abandoned the moment his message had arrived the evening before. There would be time for all of that later, she realized. Time to figure out logistics and moving dates and which of her belongings actually belonged in a house this grand, versus which ones she would happily leave behind. For now, she simply wanted to sit in the quiet kitchen with her coffee, watching the morning light stretch slowly across the counter, letting herself fully feel the shape of this new life settling into place around her. Nikolai found her there 20 minutes later, still in his sweater, humming quietly to herself as she stared out the window at the hills rolling away toward the city. He didn't say anything at first, simply crossed the kitchen and wrapped his arms around her from behind, resting his chin against the top of her head. "Regretting it already," he teased softly, though there was no real worry in his voice, only quiet contentment. Claire leaned back against him, smiling at the warmth of his arms around her. "Not even a little," she said. "I was just thinking about everything that had to happen for us to end up standing in this kitchen together. A cheating fiancé, a wrong number, a stranger who decided to reply instead of ignoring it. I've never been so grateful for bad handwriting on a keyboard," Nikolai murmured against her hair, and Claire laughed, swatting lightly at his arm before turning in his embrace to face him properly. "Whatever this life holds," she said, her tone turning more serious now, searching his eyes carefully. "The danger, the parts of your world I still don't fully understand yet, the things that might still come looking for us even after Victor. I need you to know I'm choosing all of it, Nikolai. Not just the easy parts." Nikolai's expression softened completely, all traces of teasing fading into something deeper and more solemn. "I know," he said quietly, "and I promise you, every single day, I will work to make sure that choice never costs you more than you're willing to give. You will never stand outside in the rain again, Claire. Not while I'm still breathing." She rose onto her toes and kissed him softly, sealing the promise between them without need for further words. Outside the kitchen window, the morning sun continued climbing steadily over the hills, chasing away the last shadows of the night before, and Claire Whitmore stood wrapped in the arms of the man who had turned her worst night into the beginning of everything she hadn't known she was searching for.